one more part of Priscilla's story, or Prisca. Timothy remained with us that whole night through. He slept in the shop, ready to unbar the door when Paul returned and knocked for entrance. But Paul didn't return. So Timothy, when he left the following morning, promised to watch for him and send him back for a fuller account of this lovely woman, Phoebe, from Cenchreae. About mid-morning, the great and gorgeous Erastus processed into the North Market. He circled the shops anti-sunwise, then paused by ours and rapped on the collapsible workbench that Aquila had built. He had come to hear his dear friend Paul, he said. We told him that Paul wasn't here. He said he was sorry to have missed the apostle, but glad, he said, knocking the workbench with his heavy ring finger, glad to hear that Timothy had slept well, even if not in his usual room in the house of the manager of markets. Surely Timothy would this night exchange the rough quarters of a market shop for the soft pallet of a private domicile. Oh, and would we let him, Erastus, know when Paul was ready to teach again? We said we would. He thanked us and careered onward. 6 or 7 others were lounging outside our door. I told them I wouldn't be surprised if Paul didn't come at all that day. They said they'd wait. In fact, he didn't show. Well, autumn was here, lengthening nights and shortening days. The greater number of those who regularly gathered for Paul's teaching were spending their daylight hours in the orchards and the vineyards, harvesting dates and the sweeter fruits, tending grapes, treading grapes. Slaves and servants, merchants, smiths, artisans, shopkeepers, even the bankers who financed shipping during these last weeks of the moderate seas, everyone was more occupied than usual. In summer and in winter, people had time for talk and the instruction of their souls. In autumn, they bent to their labors. And last year at this time, Paul had diminished his public teaching in order to train a few people privately, preparing us to teach as he taught. I assumed he was doing the same again this year. Last autumn, he had selected 5 of us, me, Aquila, the mild Stephanus, Titius Justus, Timothy, of course, and Silvanus, until that one vanished. Paul declared that he wouldn't be staying in Corinth forever. He wanted to leave teachers behind. He wanted to send teachers and preachers out into the surrounding cities and villages. Well, and he had excellent candidates for this same training this year. Gaius, Crispus, a freedman named Tertius who could write as well as Timothy, a slave they called Achaicus, and Phoebe. I was already thinking great thoughts for that wonderful woman named Phoebe. So there was no reason to be troubled if Paul were absent for a day. I assumed that he, like any farmer in the fall, was harvesting what he'd sown in spring, preachers to preach the gospel. But neither did he return that evening, not to the houses that often fed him, not to the shop for sleeping. By nightfall, Timothy came by, but without news. Erastus, true to his word, had gone around the city asking after Paul. When he discovered nothing on his own, he'd send a swarm of his clients out of the city to the Holocross road covered with cargo and foreigners, to Isthmia in one direction, to Lycaon in the other. But these too failed to find the apostle. Erastus had grown uneasy. He suggested that Timothy spend the second night with us, ready to run and comfort his anxious heart the minute that Paul appeared. I lay down in darkness and did not sleep. Aquila did. He slept as soundly as ever. Timothy, too, on a pallet downstairs, soon filled the shop with a moist and peaceful snoring. He had consoled himself by recalling Paul's fierce independence. Really, Prisca, he'd said, as I stood at the ladder, a lamp in my hand, it's his nature to be solitary, beholden to no one. I said, but who will massage him in the morning? Timothy looked at me with sudden, searching scrutiny. Then he smiled his beautiful Grecian smile. It turned his cheeks to wreaths and sealed the kinship between us. We had a shared ministration. "Go to sleep," Timothy said. "Paul knows his limits as well as he knows his friends." I climbed the ladder and I doused the light, but I did not go to sleep. Paul knows his limits. Timothy was so young, such a sunny boy. He could have the heart of a son or brother, surely, but not the heart of a sister to Paul, nor the fears of a mother. I agreed Paul knew his limits, but I never believed he'd choose to live among them or within them. I lay listening to the wind outside, gazing through the cracks in the louvers. It was a starry, cold autumnal night. I rolled to my stomach, sighing, "No, but Paul defies the limits." I could not keep my mind in the loft. I kept wondering if he was even then exposing his flesh to the elements, endangering himself. There were whole nights when he would climb the Acrocorinth alone and not come down till morning. Even for only one night, the practice frightened me. What would cause him to linger for two? He told me of the scent of the pagan shrines he passed, of his own convulsive loathing at the goat smell, his bright hatred for the guttural utterance and the worship of demonic shadows. I don't pretend to understand his motives, why he was drawn toward things he despised, why he would hazard the lairs of the enemy, why he put his body to tests of such severity, the climbing, the cold, the winds that tore at the top, a height frightful to a man afraid of heights. No, Paul assaults the limits. He told me that high on the northern summit of the rock, he would pray out loud, would shout his supplications into the teeth of the screaming wind, encircled, he told me, by the pale population of the heavens. He would watch and wait and plead for Christ to come, in whose gaze all would be still, and all would be sweet, and all would be warmer than the wings of the hen who gathers her chicks together. But his uncontrollable yearnings, he told me, and his very pleadings shamed him for the sake of the nations below, unto whom he had not preached. "Come, Jesus, don't come yet." There was so much left to do. Paul told me these things with water in his eyes, with a look so distant and mysterious that I thought he had caught a vision. He was seeing with spirit eyes things I could not see. And it scared me because one of us no longer seemed to inhabit the truer world. One had been transported and one had been left behind. And I didn't know which of these was Paul and which was his little Priscilla. What, I wondered, in the dread of my midnight waking, could have kept him exposed on the rock for 2 nights running? What might consume him there, and what would he be when he descended to us again? Or would Jesus come and pluck us one by one? Oh, that would be the cruelest harvest of all. I waited for the nighttime knock, but no one knocked, and Timothy's slumber continued unbroken.